All natives were forced to go to church. Colonization, right? We were forced to come in here. We were heathens, right? We were savages. We had to come in here and have the white man save our souls. That's what we were taught. Finding these unidentified graves, unidentified bodies in the ground there. Of course natives are going to be pissed off.
It's the CBC. I'm hoping none of you were expecting actual journalism. It's only 3 years too late, but the CBC has finally decided to get around to investigating one of the most heartbreaking stories to come out of Canada in modern times. The string of church arsons right across our country starting in the summer of 2021. In typical CBC fashion, instead of doing actual journalism, the journalists who take our taxpayer money and pump out propaganda disguised as news have decided to excuse and justify the attacks on Canadian churches as some sort of rational response to Canada's colonial history. In other words, Canadian Christians, many of whom are Indigenous themselves, had it coming. True North immediately began reporting on the church arsons when they started happening, unlike the CBC, who merely copy and pasted much of their reporting from wire services like the Canadian Press. To date, since 2021, 96 churches across Canada have been vandalized or set on fire, following a string of global media reports which falsely asserted that mass graves and bodies had been found on the sites of former residential schools. Not a single bone has been dug up to confirm these assertions, but at no point in the CBC's, quote, investigation did that important fact come up. And the CBC's disastrous reporting on this issue gets even more egregious. In fact, the church burnings in Canada haven't stopped. In the lead up to Christmas, just last month, 4 rural Alberta churches were set on fire. Of the 33 church fires which were deemed major fires at the time, as in the churches have been irrecoverably ruined, only 9 of the 33 fires have led to arrests. Do you think the response from the Canadian government and the Canadian media would have been the same if 96 synagogues had been burned or vandalized in the same way? Or if 96 mosques had been burned or vandalized in this way? I'll leave that question up to you, but I think we all know the answer to that. Before we get into the show, drop a like in the video, help us out by subscribing to the True North YouTube channel, stick around for the ratio of the week, and the common question for the episode is this: why did it take the CBC 3 years to investigate this story? Let me know your answer in the comments below, and let's get into it. Terry Reith was the CBC journalist tasked with investigating the attacks on Christians in this country, the 96 churches which have been burned or vandalized since 2021. But his investigation doesn't seem to be much of an investigation at all. In fact, it seems to be more of an exercise in justification. Calling this reporting investigative journalism would be an insult to the profession, so we're not going to do that. But this reporting from the CBC is broken into 2 parts. The first is a written story, and the second is a video which aired in The National. Seeing as how nobody watches The National, you probably haven't seen the video. But we're going to show you this video, and notice that the justification of the church burnings begins within the first 2 seconds. Watch this.
All natives were forced to go to church. Colonization, right?
There's no evidence to suggest anywhere that all natives in Canada were forced to attend church services. But of course, that part makes it into the very first few seconds of this video, titled "Why Dozens of Churches in Canada Have Been Burned and Torched." You might think that the reporting would start with maybe a list of the churches which have been burned, but no, it begins with a falsehood that all natives were forced to attend church services.
I mean, I'm pissed at the church. I got no respect for the church. That cross has done so much damage. I mean, caused so much grief and killed so many people, not just native people.
And again, why not just throw another attack on Christians before getting to any actual facts?
You've walked up these steps a few times as a child?
Yeah, I didn't like it. We were forced to come in here. We were heathens, right? We were savages. We had to come in here and have the white man save our souls.
Again, 1 minute and 30 seconds in, more falsehoods. Where's the evidence to suggest that Indigenous people on reserves were forced to attend church services that took place in their own reserves?
Well, I wasn't upset. I wasn't teary-eyed or anything. I was upset that some res punks did arson. Whoever did it didn't ask for permission from the rest of the community or the chief and council. They did it under the cover of darkness, and I call that arson.
Never found out who did it?
Nobody knows who did it. We can guess. I don't think white people came here and burnt this down.
So there we go. 3 years and 2 minutes and 13 seconds into this video, we finally get to some questions about who might have been responsible for burning this beautiful historic church to the ground. And here, Chief Clarence Louis of the Osoyoos Indian Band in British Columbia believes that the people who burned that church were some res punks, as he calls it, some people who lived on the reserve.
The surge in church fires began following the discovery of potential unmarked graves on the site of the former Kamloops residential school. The news stirred up long simmering anger and resentment with the church, particularly in the Indigenous community.
Finding these unidentified graves, unidentified bodies in the ground there, of course natives are going to be pissed off. Some punks they go out and do stupid things. I can understand why they did it, but I still don't support it.
This investigation, which is many years too late, would have been far better served if they just stuck with the facts. But by throwing in falsehoods, saying that they found unidentified bodies in the ground, which is not true, just simply serves as a justification for these attacks on Christian churches. And as you saw, and as you already know, most of these churches served Indigenous congregants, Indigenous Christians, who used those churches for generations, willingly. They weren't forced to go, but they wanted to go.
Paulina Johnson has been looking into the church fires and why they're happening.
I think for many Indigenous peoples, it gives them a voice because for the longest time, Canada hasn't really actually acknowledged us.
Now, right there, you have a University of Alberta professor, it appears, saying that setting these churches on fire gives the Indigenous people a voice because Canadians weren't listening to them. Committing brutal acts of violence that strike at the heart of so many in this country, including Indigenous people, gives Indigenous Canadians a voice? Very strange.
The church fires, they're much more than just arson. It's a greater symbolic kind of narrative of Canada and Canada's relationship to Indigenous peoples, which is really lacking. It's on fire because no one's really addressing the truth of what Indigenous peoples are facing. So it leads to a larger conversation that needs to be had.
So there you have it. Excusing the church fires because Canadians aren't listening to the truth about Indigenous people in Canada. Now, what truth exactly aren't Canadians listening to at this point? Sure, the Indigenous residential school program is a blight on Canadian history. Very few people would be willing to justify Canada's historical treatment of Indigenous people. But that being said, it appears that much of what we have been taught in Canada about residential schools isn't exactly the truth. According to Nina Green in the Dorchester Review, fewer than 1/3 of Indigenous children at any time throughout the residential school program actually attended residential schools. And by 1950, nearly 90% of status Indian children were attending day schools on their reserves. In 1920, an amendment to the Indian Act made attendance at residential schools compulsory for all status Indian children, but, crucially, only if there was no day school on their reserve. During the 1920s, the demand for places in some residential schools continued to exceed the supply. In 1925, for example, Father James Maguire wrote of parents clamoring for their children's admission to the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Because of the continued demand by Indian parents for places for their children in residential schools, as well as the charitable policy in the church-run schools of taking in orphaned and destitute children and children from broken homes, residential schools were largely filled to capacity during the 1920s, and the compulsory attendance provisions of the Indian Act continued to be more honored in the breach than the observance. And this is according to data from the Department of Indian Affairs. Between 1908 and 1955, the highest recorded attendance rate of status Indian children in residential school programs was only ever just above 40%. Mind you, status Indian does not include Métis or Inuit. So when people say that all Indigenous children were forced to attend residential schools, that's just not backed up by the facts. And here, between 1910 and 1952, you can see a steady increase in status Indian children being enrolled in day schools. These are schools that are on reserve land, and students go home at the end of the day to their parents. I want to stress that the reason for showing you these facts is not to try and justify the residential school program as the CBC and other activists have justified church burnings. I'm merely trying to show you that much of what we have been told about the Indian residential school program isn't actually true. In the written report of CBC's, quote, investigation, you will find one of the most outrageous things I've read in the CBC, which is quite a high bar, to be honest. Once you scroll past the trigger warning at the top of the article, you will come to a paragraph where CBC's intent to justify these church burnings becomes very clear. Some researchers and community leaders suggest that Canada's colonial history and recent discoveries of potential burial sites at former residential schools may have lit the fuse. Interesting, because I feel like maybe the CBC's false reporting and the New York Times false reporting and the many legacy media articles published about the so-called findings, which were not actually true at all, which probably had more to do with lighting the fuse than Canada's colonial history. Furthermore, maybe it was Gerald Butts, Justin Trudeau's former principal secretary, justifying the attacks on Christians on Twitter. Maybe it was Harsha Walia, the former BC Civil Liberties Union head, who said on Twitter, "Burn it all down." Reckless reporting and cheering on acts of criminal violence had more to do with this than Canada's colonial history, but not according to the CBC. Now, social media lit up after the CBC published this investigation into the church burnings. I want to highlight David Mulrooney, Canada's former ambassador to China, who wrote this on Twitter over CBC's really shoddy reporting here. Journalism CBC style. We finally learn more about the shockingly widespread arson, but are advised that Canada's colonial history and recent discoveries of potential burial sites at former residential schools may have lit the fuse. He goes on, arson is a potentially deadly crime and a profoundly cruel means of terrorizing a community. It cannot be justified or explained, a sentiment that is widely shared but significantly underreported by ideologically driven media. Very well said. Here was a quote from another X user. This is journalism in Canada, paid for by the taxpayer. Day late and $1 short after 70+ Christian churches were set ablaze. Literally over a year later and still happening today. Punchline, white Christian colonists had it coming. Investigative reporter Sam Cooper also chimed in. More likely that BC Civil Liberties Union director said that burn it all down lit the fuse. Strangely enough, the same person that recently applauded Hamas hang gliders. And Chris Tomlinson over at the European Conservative wrote this. This CBC report on the anti-Christian church fires essentially defends them and supports them as justified anger from Aboriginals instead of anti-Christian hate. Screw the CBC. And he follows it up by saying this. The CBC's Terry Reith produced this garbage and not once pushed back on any of the anti-Catholic and anti-Christian nonsense presented in it. Now, Justin Trudeau did condemn the church fires when they were happening at a significant rate in 2021, but interestingly, there's been no government inquiry into what's going on. Seeing as how many of these arsons are an open case and there's been no culprit found, you might think that a government inquiry into what's been going on against Christians in this country might be worthwhile. But no, nobody really seems that interested in getting to the bottom of what's been going on. This reporting was many years too late from the CBC, and brushing it off and saying better late than never doesn't really count. The taxpayer gives the CBC money with the expectation that they will tell the news accurately and timely and give us the facts and not justify violence and criminal behavior. Is it really any surprise that the CBC is failing at this point? Despite getting billions of dollars every year from the government, they're still laying off journalists. They still have to downsize. Nobody watches them. Nobody reads them. No Canadians trust the CBC. Maybe it's because they produce work like this. Ratio of the week time. The winner this week is the Liberal Party of Canada. You know, it's been a tough week for the Liberals. The week started off when Chrystia Freeland had David Menzies of Rebel News arrested for simply asking her some questions. It turns out that you're not allowed to actually ask Liberal cabinet ministers questions they don't want to answer. Freedom of the press, it appears, is a one-way street, but you already all knew that. In perfect timing, as the Liberals often do, as they were being blasted all over the world for having David Menzies arrested, well, the Liberals followed up by making a campaign post on X a few days later when they compared Pierre Poilievre's handling of the media to Donald Trump. Take a look at this video they posted. Here's how Pierre Poilievre treats Canada's free press. Remind you of anyone? If it was unclear for anyone, the Liberal strategy for 2024 is to try and compare Pierre Poilievre to Donald Trump. They think that's going to be some sort of winning strategy. Maybe it will help them in the polls. I doubt it, but they're going to try. I doubt it because it appears Canadians aren't buying it one bit. 6.4 thousand replies to only 3.2 thousand likes, a serious ratio here. Calling out Pierre Poilievre for being a little confrontational toward a biased and paid-off liberal press when you had a journalist arrested for asking you a question is quite rich. Even for the liberals, I'm surprised they let this post go public. By the way, has Donald Trump ever had a reporter arrested for asking him questions? Has Pierre Poilievre ever had a reporter arrested for asking him questions? I know that Andrew Scheer and Melissa Lantsman did the same to Rebel News reporters, but I'm talking specifically about Pierre Poilievre here, not that I know of. This from Rebel News videographer Efren Monsanto: the liberals have absolutely no shame. This from Rob Primo: we get it. Rather than denounce the federal police for grabbing a journalist by the throat and smashing him into a wall for asking a question and arresting him, you would rather deflect that attention elsewhere. Not going to happen, you communist criminals. And this from another user: your regime is jailing journalists who don't please you. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I'd rather some pushback against bought and paid for propagandists rather than having a government literally arresting journalists for asking tough questions. It's unbelievable that that's where we're at. And shame on the RCMP. All right, everyone, that's going to do it for us this week on the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Harrison Faulkner, and this is Ratio.